Steve Thackeray. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, nice to hear from you. Thanks for having me on.
Great. I want to preface this by saying that you are a doctor, so PhD, but you're an ecologist, and so therefore most ecologists don't use the prefix doctor, do they?
I guess it depends what kind of area and what kind of business or company that we work for. In research institutes like the one I work for, or in universities, it's quite common for people to use their title, but maybe in other areas, perhaps in consultancies and things like that, it's maybe not quite so common. So it's probably a little bit context dependent.
Yeah, I figured I'd ask because I did interview an ecologist out in California who did not want to be called
Oh, really?
doctors. So yeah,
Oh, that's
so
interesting.
I
Yeah.
yeah, I was curious to see if that was across the field or just very specific environments.
Yeah, it seems to be quite a variable thing. I think everybody, not in day-to-day conversation, but certainly in sort of official things, people tend to use their titles, sort of around where I work anyway. So, yeah.
Okay, and let's talk a little bit about that. Let's see, what exactly is it that you do for a living?
Okay, so as you say, I'm an ecologist, but my particular specialism is freshwater ecology. So I'm particularly interested in the wildlife that lives in lake environments, in particular lakes and reservoirs. Um, I'm interested in how communities of plankton in particular, but other groups of organisms like fish and other organisms besides, how their communities change, what affects the diversity of those communities, and how they might respond to environmental change. So I guess a lot of the wildlife that I'm interested in, sort of professionally and personally, is beneath the water surface, maybe hidden away from a lot of people who don't have specialist kit to help sort of unlock that world for them.
So you have what I would perceive as a very cool job.
Oh,
I mean,
excellent.
you really do get to look, like you said, at the world that most people don't have access to or don't get to see on a day-to-day basis. I mean, do you feel like it's a it's a job that's cool to you? Is this something you're very passionate about?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is the thing that made me want to go into this area, actually. I've been interested in wildlife and in ecology for quite a long time, since I was a child, really. But I think when I got to university and I started studying ecology as a degree subject, I had some modules there in there about freshwater ecology. And that's what really brought it home to me, that there are all these different creatures and all these different things happening below the water surface in places that aren't really desperately obvious every day. And I just thought that was such an intriguing idea, such a powerful idea. I love the thought that if you had the right kit, you could actually go and you could see these things, and you could sort of open up this new world. And that's never really left me. I don't think. I just think I guess it's quite thrilling to be looking at some of these creatures. You feel a sort of element of I don't know, feeling privileged to be able to see these things, I think.
Yeah, it's fun because I bought myself a microscope, as you know,
Yeah.
last year out of a pretty much, just out of the blue, and I fell in love with this amazing new world that I discovered. It was so beautiful. It was so diverse. The diversity alone in a few drops of water is quite profound, and I mean, I started, talking about it, taking videos and stuff like that. uh, I bought myself a couple of microscopes on Amazon. Now, you say, that you need the right kit. What to use the right kit to observe the water life that you observe every day?
Well, I think, in terms of microscopes and things, we've probably got quite similar things. I mean, I use binocular microscopes for some of the larger organisms that I look at. We have some more powerful inverted microscopes as well for smaller organisms. But looking at the quality of what you produce, I think we probably have quite similar levels of kit. But that's part of it, the sort of the stuff that you use in the lab to be able to see these things. And then the other part is having the equipment to collect your samples as well. So having different water sampling devices or plankton nets and that kind of thing, so that you can actually collect samples from the field in different places, so you've got something to bring back and look at under the microscope. So there are lots of different elements, I suppose, that come together to let you go out and actually see what's there in lots of different habitats. And yeah, having access to that really, just as you say, it opens up a sort of new world, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a bit like I don't know if you've ever done, virtual reality.
Yeah,
Have you tried that before?
only a little bit, only a little bit. Um, yeah, but I can imagine that's right. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, that's exactly what it felt like. It felt like being in a VR environment, but except that in this case, it was real,
yeah.
you know?
I like the idea of
Um,
VR plankton. I think that's a superb idea. That would be,
it would
wouldn't that
be
be good?
yeah, we need to get some game developers on a call here.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right.
So how do you collect your samples? Because when I go out, I just use a little pipette and I just grab a little bit from the shoreline and things
Mhm.
like that. Now, your techniques are obviously much more complex. So how do you gather your samples? What can you explain that to us?
Okay, well, I mean, there are so many different ways of collecting plankton samples, and they've all got their sort of pros and cons. A lot of what we gather with plankton nets. So that's pretty much as basic as it sounds. A net that you would tow either horizontally behind a boat, or you might lower it with a weight on it to the bottom of a lake and then pull it back towards the surface. But the mouth of that net is quite wide, compared to the opening of a pipette. So you'll be collecting a lot and processing a lot more water. And what that means is you'll collect more organisms on the one hand, but also you've got more chance of catching relatively rare things as well if you have a bigger net. So you can get these quite big samples, and if you collect lots of samples in different places, you get a more representative set of samples as well, telling you more about what's actually there in that community because you miss fewer things. So we tend to do quite a lot of net sampling work. That works quite well for bigger plankton, things like water fleas, cladocerans and copepods and things like that. For algae and for protozoans and arguably for rotifers and things as well, often it's better to collect a water sample rather and not use a net, but actually bring the water back to the lab and settle out the organisms in the water. Because even the finest nets with the very narrowest mesh size, with the smallest holes in them, will still let some of those creatures through. So you'll still miss things. Whereas if you collect the water and sediment it in the lab, you end up with a really nice concentrated little soup, I guess, of these very tiny creatures, which you can then pipette up and look at. So there's an element of modifying your sampling methods depending on really what you want to pick out. Um, yeah, and so these are very traditional methods, I guess, for collecting things.
Right. And so you mentioned a plankton net. Let's actually break that down a little bit. What exactly is plankton?
Okay, yeah, sure. So the plankton are the organisms that really live suspended in the open water, in lakes and reservoirs, in the ocean too, actually, and in slow-moving rivers. So it's an incredibly diverse community. Some of these organisms are tiny plants, types of algae. Some of them are actually technically animals because they're very minute crustaceans, say. But there are other organisms in there that are protozoans as well. So it's and actually the bacteria that are there as well are sort of bacterial plankton. So you can imagine that this whole community is incredibly diverse. There are multiple kingdoms of life represented in there as well. So you have these organisms that are suspended out in the open water that we call plankton, but it gets a little bit sort of blurry around the edges in the sense that there are some species that are really quite closely associated with, say, submerged plants in the edge of a water body, or quite closely associated with the sediment at the bottom. And they spend more of their time in those structured habitats, but sometimes stray into the open water. So they're sort of, in a way, kind of semi-planktonic. So you get this kind of gradient in lifestyles within these organisms as well. But really what we're talking about is lots of tiny creatures that live out in the water. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned bacterial plankton. I've never heard that term before. I didn't even know that there was such a thing. What is it?
Well, so just as you have bacteria in other kinds of places, I mean, you have them out in the open water as well. Um, some of the bacteria, I guess, would be sort of free, independent particles themselves in the plankton, but quite often they're actually colonizing little bits of organic material that are suspended in the water as well. So you can get little aggregates of, say, leaf litter or sort of decaying body parts of organisms or something like that, and bacteria will colonize those little bits of organic matter. So you can actually have really quite a thriving bacterial community too, alongside some of these other organisms that we've both been looking at, down the microscope.
Can you give me an example of a few names that maybe I could ring a bell and maybe Google later?
Oh gosh, I'm not an expert on bacteria, so I'd probably have
Oh,
to do
okay.
the same as you
I was
actually.
curious. I had to ask.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So why do you look at plankton?
Well, the plankton are actually really important for the functioning of these ecosystems. So they're tiny, of course, very small, but it doesn't mean they're not very influential. They're super abundant, and on the one hand, these plankton can affect the quality of the water. So if you think about algae, if you get very dense growths of algae, the water becomes less clear, maybe a little murky. If you have growths of blue-green algae or cyanobacteria, you can get algal blooms and scums of algae floating on the surface of the water body. All of this can have an effect on the wider habitat, for instance, oxygen concentrations that are important for other organisms, but it can also affect the extent to which you want to use that water body yourself, because some of these you might not want to go swimming or let your pets in the water if there are these big scums of algae along the edge of the water, especially given that some of those organisms can produce toxins that could make you sick. So the algae affect the water quality, but at the same time, they're providing energy for other organisms in that ecosystem as well. So as they grow, they're providing a food source for other things. So they're supporting the food web. At the same time, the plankton are also providing food for organisms much higher up in the food web, like fish, for instance. So, which would be of interest to anybody who is a angler or has an interest in sort of fish and fish ecology. A great many fish species eat larger animal plankton, if you like, and certainly when they're in the larval stages. So these plankton organisms, they're affecting the quality of the water, they're supporting the food web at different levels as well, and producing oxygen, affecting how nutrients are cycled. They're really kind of fundamental players in these ecosystems.
You mentioned algal blooms.
Yeah.
What exactly causes that?
Okay, well, that's a really good question. There are quite a few factors that come together, I think, to create these blooms. I mean, the algae will be growing in the water year round at some level of abundance. But what happens in an algal bloom is that the conditions become such that the growth of those algae really starts to pick up, really starts to accelerate. So it's often a case of if there's a lot of limiting nutrient in that water. So if there's a lot of phosphorus in the water, for instance, then there's lots of potential for algae to grow because they need that nutrient to grow alongside some others too. So if you have lots of nutrients available and the water's nice and warm, those two things can mean that the algae can grow very, very rapidly and create a bloom. But there are, lots of other things going on in terms of sort of the weather conditions can influence how blooms form and maybe collapse and get moved around on the surface of water bodies as well. So it can be quite a complex picture.
Yeah, it's something happened this spring actually on the Rideau Canal here in Ottawa is that it became covered in this lime green sludge. Let's just call it that.
Okay.
And it was kind of like a filamentous kind of algae. And I'd never seen it like that before. And it turned out that it was because I guess the people who manage the Rideau Canal, I'm not sure who, the government, I guess,
Mm.
didn't have time to pass, I guess, like an algae machine or something that kind of breaks it up. Is that something that helps manage the control of algal blooms? Do you know?
I think I'm not so sure about that. I think maybe some of the better solutions for algal problems are really out of the water in the surrounding land and in the catchment. You're controlling that input of nutrients from the surrounding land and maybe coming in from wastewater treatment works as well. You're really cutting off the resources that the algae use if you can control that input of nutrients. And it's probably one of the sort of single most important things you can do really to control those algal blooms. when they're actually growing in the water already, you're trying to fix an issue that's already there, rather than sort of taking a step back and thinking about what might have caused it.
Ah, okay. And so when you say nutrients, what exactly are you talking about?
So there are certain chemical elements that are really essential for the growth of these organisms. And when it comes to algal blooms, it's quite often the case that in freshwaters anyway, that phosphorus and nitrogen are particularly important. So if you have high concentrations of those nutrients, you have the potential for quite large algal populations to grow and for blooms to develop. Now, whether they do depends on other things as well, like sort of the appropriate weather conditions and the water being warm, and there not being excessive grazing and things like that as well. But having those high concentrations of phosphorus and nitrogen can really allow algae to grow.
Is it possible to grow algae at home?
Well, yeah, I guess it is really. I mean, we grow them in the lab in sort of small scale experiments on the bench top. Actually, if you bring some water out of your pond and place it on the windowsill in a jam jar, you'll probably find some algae growing in there fairly soon, just in the light and the warmth of that. Yeah, so it's you'll certainly be able to get some material to look at, I'm sure, that way.
Hmm, cool. Yeah, it's only happened to me once, but only because I had a moss ball in that jar.
Oh,
So I
right.
got a bunch of algae.
Yeah, I bet.
Uh, um, so, you observe quite a few things in the lake environment with plankton and all that. What are some invasive species that you always keep an eye out for?
Okay, so that freshwater systems, there are quite a lot of different invasive species that we're becoming aware of. One of the really interesting, well, I use interesting in inverted commas because I suppose it causes some concern. Um, but there's a particular water flea, spiny water flea, Bithotrephis longimanus would be the Latin name for it, which has actually been introduced into some North American lakes, and once there has had an impact on the plankton community there. So that's considered to be not native to those systems and is an invasive species. So we can have plankton invasive species as illustrated by that example. But in the UK, there are other groups of organisms that we consider to be invasives as well. So zebra mussels, for instance, are raising quite a lot of concern in some water bodies in the UK, as are particular species of freshwater shrimp, which have started sort of spreading among water bodies fairly recently. And in actually one of the study systems that we work on in the Lake District in Windermere, just last year we found a fish species in our gillnet samples that hadn't been caught there before, and that's called the ruff. It's a sort of relative of the perch, more or less, quite closely related, and not native to that ecosystem. So somehow or other, they've arrived there. And rough are quite potentially quite impactful species. They can reproduce quite early in their lives, and actually more than once a year. They can actually have quite high population growth rates, and they can also feed on the eggs of other fish species. So you can imagine that there can be a cause for concern if they, really establish in a new environment. So the invasives that we see in freshwaters are really from quite a diverse um, group of organisms, lots of different types of species.
Yeah, zebra mussels are a huge problem in Ontario here.
Oh, okay.
Um, yeah, it's something I think it's affecting mostly the Great Lakes, if I'm not mistaken, but it is a massive issue, and I think that zebra mussels come in on ships, don't they?
I think yeah, that's right. I think that essentially humans can um, help many of these organisms move around the globe, sort of short circuiting, if you like, the barriers that might prevent them from dispersing all on their own. So yes, certainly shipping traffic can move organisms around, and in the UK certainly there's been really quite a push to strongly encourage people at a smaller scale within the country who are moving their boats and their kit around to just be very careful and very vigilant and make sure they clean their kit and check everything through that so that there's nothing, no organisms stuck to it, that nothing obviously there that they could move from one place to another. I believe that one of the main things you can do about invasive species is essentially try not to let them get there in the first place, because once they establish, it's very hard to do anything about it.
Yeah, that's what I was actually wondering was that you described this perch-like fish called a ruff, and I was wondering what is the process once you find this fish? What happens next?
Well, it's very early days. We've caught just a couple of specimens of it, and now really, once now it's in that system, there's not really much we can do to sort of remove all the rough, such as they are, however many there are, from that system. We just have to now see how their populations develop, and I think that it's not a foregone conclusion, by the way, that once a new species arrives somewhere, it's definitely going to establish, reach huge numbers, have an enormous impact. That can happen sometimes, of course, but sometimes ecosystems have a degree of resistance around them and can resist a new species arriving and establishing. So, and the way that might happen is that the species that are resident, if you like, the ones that are already there, might really strongly compete with the new species that arrives, or they might be predators of it, or there might be parasites there that then attack the new species that arrives. So there are these kinds of these areas in which this new ecosystem could potentially resist this inward movement of new species, and it's a hugely complex picture, and uh, I guess we just have to see how things develop from here on in, whether that population will establish or whether there'll be mechanisms there that stop them really achieving great numbers.
Oh, that's really fascinating. Yeah, I hadn't thought about the kind of wait and see approach that is necessary to really monitor. Essentially, you're monitoring now, is what's happening, right?
That's right. Yeah, and monitoring these systems is incredibly important because that's how we build our understanding of how they function. So, actually, in freshwater ecology, one of the interesting features of long-term monitoring schemes is that they have this tradition of really monitoring lots of different aspects of the environment all in the same place at the same time. So we tend to go out and look at physical things like water temperature and light penetration, also chemical things like nutrients and oxygen, and lots of different biological measures too. So we try to get this, I guess, this kind of whole ecosystem picture of how things are changing. And when you gather data like that and you interpret those data and you do some sort of statistical analysis and some modeling, you've got a chance then to learn how the system works, to try and understand what the mechanisms are that govern how that system works. And you can use that understanding then to sort of suggest maybe future approaches to management of water bodies. So those long-term data sets are really ever so important in terms of teaching us how the systems work.
You said light penetration. That's something I'd never even thought about. So, if you were monitoring a lake that at the time had very short trees, and then the trees grew over time, let's say over a 30-year period, and now there's less light coming into the lake, would that cause a problem?
So if you have less light penetration, yeah, I mean there are all sorts of ecological responses to that. So I guess with the tree example, it would probably have to be quite a small water body for the trees to cast shade across the surface of it, if you see what I mean. Um, but there are other things that cause reductions in light penetration. So for instance, if you have a lot of coloured organic material washing in from the soils in the surrounding land, that can give a sort of brown staining to the water, which then prevents light penetrating very deeply. Now, if you have less light penetration, actually, that makes the environment a little bit more difficult to live in for organisms like algae that photosynthesize. So you're reducing the amount of light available for those organisms, and it could be that light fails to reach the sediment of a water body where it used to reach there before. So any plants growing there may then have a hard time actually photosynthesizing. So changes in underwater light can affect that balance between, where is the primary production? Where is the photosynthesis happening? Is it happening in the water? Is it happening on the bed of the lake? Is it both? It can really affect that balance by just affecting how far in the light goes. And I guess, behind the scenes of these big bulk changes in how much algae you've got or how many plants grow, you'll get different species um, in those different kinds of contexts. So some species are really quite well adapted to low light conditions. They have features that allow them to be efficient at absorbing light in those situations, whereas other species really don't. So you're actually really encouraging a sort of turnover in the community, a change in which species are there and dominating.
Hmm. Now I'm curious. Do you guys monitor things like disease? Like, is there such a thing as a disease that could come over and kill a lot of the plankton in a lake?
There are diseases out there, so it's not something I've personally looked at, but there are indeed people that do look at parasites and diseases of planktonic organisms. So there are bacteria that will colonize zooplankton, things like Daphnia species, for instance. There are fungal parasites that would infect certain algae, certain diatoms. So there are certainly diseases in those systems which could potentially have an impact on the populations of plankton, either by killing individuals or by affecting how they grow and how they reproduce. So there's that whole, yeah, those kind of host parasite, host disease dynamics are all happening in these systems as well.
Steve, what's your favorite creature?
Oh, well, now I'm so obviously I'm a little tiny bit obsessed with planktonic organisms, as you might have picked up. So I think I'm probably not going to be awfully popular, but I think Bithytrephes, which is sadly this invasive species in North America, is in its home range where I am. It's one of my favourites. Um, it's a really striking looking creature. It's a lot of zooplankton, animal plankton organisms, the sort of crustacean things, are maybe a millimetre or two in size, but these are rather longer because they have a really long tail spine which is really sort of very, very striking and grasping limbs. They're predatory organisms, so they have these grasping limbs for capturing their prey and these enormous bug compound eyes. So you can imagine they're quite alien-looking things. And I just find them really very striking. But yeah, I know there'll be a lot of people who aren't as keen on them as I am.
Sorry, Steve, can you say their name again for me?
Bithytrephes.
Sorry, say it again?
So it's Bithytrephes.
I don't even know if I could even say that again. Uh, do they have a common name?
But they're called the spiny water flea, I believe.
Spiny water flea.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
you'll be able to find them if you search for that.
All right. And that's it's funny because like I said earlier, is that I've been observing pond life for a while, and I am learning that a lot of creatures like copepods have common names like cyclops, for example, which make learning about creatures a lot easier. So that's something that for people who are perhaps new to observing pond life, is that you can always look for more common terms. Like if you hear, spiny water flea, then you can learn the more scientific name, which is fun.
Yeah.
Do you did you did you have, did you always have an interest in learning about pond creatures? Like, were you reading about pond life when you were little?
I think it came along a little bit later than that probably because I started out, I guess my sort of love of wildlife started with bird watching first, when I was about 11, something like that. So that's and then when we were out looking at birds with me and my dad, because I'd like to think I got my dad into it rather than the other way around. Um, I started to notice other things, start to look at the plants and the insects and things as well as we were around, and it just encourages a more general love of nature. And I think certainly going out and doing that, you become aware of some of the more obvious freshwater things like, fish and amphibians and water birds and things like that, and dragonflies and those sorts of things. But I think the kind of world of plankton for me came along rather much, much later, when I got to university and started taking courses that were really just about those communities. And I think that's probably why I found it quite mind-blowing because it wasn't an area that I'd really thought about a great deal before. So yeah, that must have had quite an impact on me, I guess.
Yeah, it's fascinating how the average person doesn't know, what a diatom is or what a copepod is or even a water
Mm.
flea. It is really a hidden world. What do you think that people could do, scientists especially, to perhaps educate the public about lake ecology and plankton and all these things?
It's a really interesting question, actually. I mean, I think there's a lot of potential there because these things are so hidden away. Um, So some of the things I've done in the past is I've been into schools and I've taken plankton microscopes with me. I showed school children some of these organisms, and that always goes down really well. Actually, the children love to see them, and they usually want to know if one species had a fight with the other one, which one would win. That's the usual question, um, to which I usually come up with some kind of answer. But there's always so much enthusiasm actually seeing those organisms, and I think seeing things firsthand has to really help. It makes it rather less abstract, um, I think, because often the organisms that have captured the imagination are really quite big charismatic things, aren't they? Some of the conservation relevant species, the sort of flagship species we see, tend to be quite big charismatic things, and there are these super charismatic microfauna, if you like, there as well. And I think we just got to sort of maybe build some familiarity with what they are and how they look. So I certainly post a lot of videos of creatures on social media, and people see them there. And when I've shown people sort of locally some of these videos of some of these creatures, they've been really interested to see them. It felt maybe with shades of horror as well, because they're quite strange looking things. So I think it's sort of going out there and showing people what these things look like, and talking to them about the importance of these organisms as well. So we would have to go beyond, look at this, it's a curiosity. Aren't these things just interesting? Because they are, of course, but to sort of go from that to, and by the way, these things have an effect on the quality of your water. Or these organisms actually feed the fish that you might like to go angling for. Trying to bring it into people's everyday lives must surely be part of the issue, I guess.
Yeah, it's I've always said that tardigrades or water bears are the
Yeah.
gateway to the microscopic life. They do have those charismatic features that you were discussing earlier that perhaps,
Mm.
people are used to seeing baby lions and blue jays and stuff. I think tardigrades are probably one of the key creatures that scientists can use to really kind of introduce people to that world. One of the questions that came up once when I was showing, I think it was on a Twitch stream or something. I was
Mhm.
showing people tardigrades, and someone asked me, "What is the purpose of a tardigrade?" And I did not have an answer to that. Would you have an answer to that?
Well, I'm not sure that they sort of have a purpose in that sense. I think tardigrades, like everything else, have evolved to exist in for a certain set of circumstances, in response to a certain opportunity. These organisms have adapted and evolved to be able to survive, and their ultimate purpose is to reproduce and keep going, isn't it?
Mhm.
So these organisms have filled the available niches, the available spaces, if you like, for them in the natural world, and I guess that is their purpose, to do that and to continue to reproduce. I guess in the grander scheme of things, all these organisms ultimately make a contribution to the way that whole ecosystems work and function, and those ecosystems then deliver things to us as well. In terms of things like clean water or fish or anything like that. So there are these links between the diversity of life, of wildlife, the way ecosystems work, and the kind of benefits that those ecosystems deliver to people. And those linkages can be, really quite complex, but they are nevertheless there. But you're absolutely right. Tardigrades have really made it in that sense. I'm certainly aware that there are a lot of people that would know what a water bear is, even if they really weren't familiar with any of the other things that we talked about, during this conversation.
Yeah, it certainly helped that it's been on, Star Trek and all these kind of pop culture,
Yeah, true.
references. We need a Star Trek episode about, copepods now, maybe,
Oh, yes, please. Yeah, that would be good.
Yes. Uh So, have you still on the subject of tardigrades, because now I'm very, very curious. Have you ever picked up any tardigrades in your lake samples?
Well, not in my lake ones, but I have picked them up in my pond at home actually. I know I think probably in the lake ones we're just too far from the edges. You know, our samples are taken right out in over the deepest point of the lake, and the tardigrades are going to be closer to vegetation and edges and things like that. But in my little pond, or indeed actually on just clumps of moss on tree trunks and things, I've certainly found them in those kinds of places. So that's quite a good thing to do actually, to just take a little bit of water and just I guess use your pipette to suck water up and down on a clump of moss, and you'll probably dislodge some tardigrades and some deloid rotifers and things that way as well. So I've sort of gone out and found them for fun, if you like, recreationally rather than professionally. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one thing that I mean, you and I both nerd out on. It's this we kind of sometimes kind of exchange likes on posts of what we
Yeah,
find in in
yeah,
local
that's right.
environments.
Well, that's
uh,
right.
One of the things I do want to bring up, because a lot of your research does really touch on the topic of climate change.
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And so, how exactly does your research impact or touch on the topic of climate change? I know that you do uh, officially research how stressors impact freshwater lakes. So,
Yeah.
what does that information tell us about how the Earth is changing?
Okay, well, some of the research I've been involved in is really quite long-term research. We talked earlier on about monitoring, and the data from monitoring schemes. If they, you know, these data sets run for decades, certainly the ones that we've been involved in, they've run for long enough now that you can actually see long-term trends in the way that ecosystems are changing, over and above the sort of year-to-year variations and day-to-day variations in how things change. And we know from our long-term water temperature records from lakes in the English Lake District that temperatures have been rising. And we actually, when we last looked at the data, just to look at these kinds of questions, we discovered, I think, that around 4 or 5 of the warmest years in our data set had occurred since the year 2000 for those lakes. So you could really see that over time there was this shift towards warming. So we can see that signal in our, if you like, our sentinel sites. Now, that's not something that's just happening in the lakes that we study. When you then go and read research from other parts of the world, from other research groups as well, you can see similar kinds of trends. And there are now increasingly more and more quite large scale studies where people have brought together data sets all across the world into the one piece of research to say, okay, well, actually, we can see on balance that warming is happening in fresh waters. And yes, there's variation in the rate of warming, but on average, we can see the signal. We can see that it's happening. So we know that temperatures are changing. We've got ample evidence for that. But we can see other things happening in these systems as well, alongside the changes in water temperature. And actually, one of the areas I've been involved in is looking at the passage of the seasons, if you like. So the time of year at which a particular biological event happens. So in the dry land environment, it might be the time of year at which birds lay their eggs or plants flower. Underwater, it's the time of year when algae reach their peak abundances, or when water fleas peak, or when fish spawn, or those kinds of seasonal events. And when we've looked at long-term records of those, we've seen a shift in lots of cases towards earlier seasonal events. And that is one of the well accepted fingerprints, if you like, of a climate change impact on the natural environment. And essentially, because warming increases rates of biological processes, it speeds up biological rates. And on top of that, temperature is used as a cue by lots of different species to time their seasonal activities as well. So we're seeing warming, but we're also seeing a response in organisms. They're shifting the timing of their seasonal behaviors earlier and earlier. And that's given us now that feel for, oh, okay, so there's an impact as well. So these long-term data sets are really now showing us that that's happening, and those kinds of changes, we see them all across the world in different locations. So we know it's not just something about the peculiarities of a particular lake that we're looking at in a particular part of the world. It's rather bigger than that.
So we know there's warming. We know there are responses to warming. Do we know the causes of warming?
So there's so bearing in mind I'm not a climate scientist per se, but there is now overwhelming consensus among climate scientists that that not just that warming is occurring, but also that humans have made a contribution to that. There's an anthropogenic contribution to warming as well. So there's a great deal of confidence now in that link. And actually, the reports produced by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, really make that statement. And there's usually a rather, there are usually quite a lot of press releases, a lot of media activity around when those reports are released. So in that sort of environment, in that scientific community, there's now a great deal of consensus about that issue.
We all know, I mean, I think we all know at least one person who's a science denier or who's kind of starting to veer that way. It's
Okay.
becoming more and more popular, I find, at least in North America. How do you, Steve, as the person, not the scientist, but also a scientist, how do you deal with listening to people hear about or talk about, climate change denial and things like that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because people will express their opinions, of course, always. So I guess I've had those kinds of conversations, and I've just gone to the evidence, I guess, in those conversations, and I've been in that position, I guess, where I can say, well, look, I work in a related area, and I've read some of the evidence, and these are the things that we're seeing. This is why people are saying that. It's not a matter of belief. There's evidence there that these changes are happening, and I try to have that conversation that there is evidence these things are actually happening, and really try to address it from that kind of perspective, really. Um, because you have to, I guess, if you any frustration you might feel, you have to sort of try and put that to one side and have that kind of rational conversation about, okay, well, here's the evidence. This is why I'm saying that this is happening. Yeah.
Makes sense. What do you do for fun on weekends?
Oh, well, sometimes fun's allowed, isn't it?
Yes.
So I have a few things I like to do. I mean, we've talked about me going out and sort of seeing nature and things, and that's certainly part of it. But I play the guitar a little bit, and I like drawing. I'm quite keen on art, so I particularly like drawing with pencils and with ink. So sometimes wildlife things, sometimes just things that I don't know, just pop into my head, I guess. But I find it very therapeutic, actually, to be able to spend some time doing something like that. I think there's something about creative things that draws your mind to that moment. It's almost a kind of mindfulness, I think, to be able to focus in that way. So I really enjoy doing things like that.
Yeah, you posted these beautiful drawings of human eyes in various forms of expressions.
Oh, thank
I
you.
found that very, very charming and quite fun. Do you endeavor to create paintings later on, or how do you want to pursue your drawings?
Well, yeah, I would actually really like to do that because I don't have a lot of experience of painting actually, and it would be really great to sort of push myself and actually learn some new skills there. Because I think I probably didn't do any painting in anger since I was at school, probably. So, that was some time ago. Um, so yeah, I would really like to try and um practice with some different media, yeah, and some different subjects as well. So with the eyes and things that you mentioned there, I'd become aware that I was drawing quite a lot of wildlife based stuff, which is great because I love it. But I thought, well, I'm not sure I can draw humans, so I wanted to try and go and try that as well, and just change the subject a little bit. So it's all about, I guess, diversifying your skills, isn't it, and sort of widening the comfort zone that you have. And I'm very very keen on trying to do that some more. There's such beautiful work produced by certainly the people I see on social media. I'd find it absolutely awe-inspiring, really, sometimes, and to try to look at that and think, oh, could I ever get anywhere close to something like that? It's quite inspiring.
There's a wonderful book called The Natural Way to Draw. This is a book that's been around for, oh, probably 50, 60 years. And it really is a good it's a good guidebook to learn how to draw, and also it's I mean, it's the one of the main books in art school, so I highly recommend it for you.
Oh, I
But
must look
it's,
that up.
yeah, yeah, The Natural Way to Draw, I believe is the title. And so you also play the guitar, which I did not know about you actually.
Oh, well, I'm maybe a little quieter about that, yeah.
What do you play?
So I have a couple of acoustics and an electric, but since the family came along, the electric tends to stay in its box a little bit, just because of the sheer noise and disturbance value of it. So I quite enjoy sort of strumming along on my acoustic to most things. I guess I enjoy sort of alternative rock music and things like that. And so I'll quite often sort of play along to something like that. But sometimes I just sort of sit there noodling away on my own, just trying to make things up. Yeah, and that's good fun.
Yeah, it's funny because one of the reasons why I don't make this podcast just about science or just about history or just about, what somebody does on a film set is that I want to kind of break down some stereotypes of people. And I think the stereotype with scientists is that they're all nerdy people who have their noses in their books. And yet here we are. I mean, I'm learning that you're kind of secretly a little rock star a little bit inside of you, you know?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, at least in my head anyway. But yeah, that's right. No, it is an amazing thing. Ultimately, we're all human, aren't we? And everybody has these things that mean something to them. So I know people that are into sort of amateur dramatics, or it might be knitting, needlework, or gardening, or sculpting. Photography, so many different things. I mean, just thinking around the people that I work with, and I love that. I mean, I love the fact that these people have that about them. That you see them in one capacity at work, and you talk about certain things, but to find out that they've got a passion, they've got something else that they really really care about, it's a wonderful thing. It's another way of that you sort of connect with someone, isn't it? And yeah, absolutely. We're not. I suppose we haven't. Many of us have got an element of mad scientist about us, but there's maybe a little bit more to it than that. Yeah.
And how did you decide? Because once people, I know a lot of students, and I know a lot of students in grad school. How did you decide after you got your PhD that you didn't want to become a professor? You wanted to do, field work, and you wanted to do research. How did you decide that?
Um, I suppose when you go through your PhD, you do actually experience quite a lot. A PhD is not one sort of homogeneous thing. You have to practice a lot of different skills in going through a typical PhD project. So certainly in an ecology PhD where you've got a mixture of say field work and lab work, and you're analysing data, and then you find you've got to be a writer and a public speaker, and you've got to do some design, and you've got to manage a project, and you've got to do a lot of different things. And I suppose if you haven't sort of been through that PhD experience, maybe that's not so obvious, but PhD researchers do so many different things. And what that means, I guess, is that you get a feel for which of these things are enjoyable things, and which things you would want to continue. And for me, going through my own PhD, just sort of being out in the field and gathering data and looking at the data from those field campaigns, that was something that I really really enjoyed, and I wanted to do more. And I guess everyone takes different experiences from that journey. But yeah, absolutely, it's amazing that in that it sounds like one role as a sort of PhD researcher, but it is so diverse. And it is amazing what some people do with that opportunity. It truly.
Mhm. Yeah, I don't I'm really disconnected with I mean, I have friends who do their or are doing their PhD, but I've never done it myself. I dropped out of university, so it's there's a reason why I ask these questions. I'm very
Yeah.
unfamiliar with the process, so I'm always curious the path that somebody takes after committing to that kind of schooling, you know?
Yeah, that's right. And people come out at the other end of it and make different decisions. Some people will continue into a research sort of place, but others might go into somewhere some more of something more applied, maybe some kind of environmental management. Some people might go into science communication and many other things besides. But yeah, everyone's journey is a little bit different. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so now I'm curious, have you always lived in the UK?
Yeah, I have actually. I have. A lot of people going through that research process may travel around quite a lot. Um, for me, I've actually always been in the UK, but then I sort of met my wife at university, and we got married during my PhD, and so we settled quite early on really. So I've been sort of based here since then really. Yeah, yeah.
Is your wife an academic or a scientist as well?
She works in a university department, but more on the administrative side of things, actually. But she essentially does a lot of management for the equivalent of a PhD program in another area. So yeah, it's a challenging role, but she does it very well.
Okay, very cool. Yeah, I've been surprised by how many guests I have who are either academics or scientists and who have married someone who's almost all, almost the same in the same field.
Oh,
So
okay.
I guess that
Yeah.
makes a partnership a little bit better. I guess there's a mutual understanding in a way.
Yeah, I guess that, there are certain, I guess, idiosyncrasies, aren't there, about that kind of job and that lifestyle where, the people you would have the understanding, as you say, of how that works. Yeah, absolutely.
So we're almost out of time, but I was just curious. I mean, we are living during a pandemic. There's not a whole lot to do these days. What's something that you're really looking forward to doing once things settle down?
I'd just love to be able to sort of get back together with my team. Actually, we see each other in two dimensions on a screen most days, and it's great to keep in touch with people. But I would just really like to see everyone in person again, and just sort of be able to kind of work together, but also just be able to sort of have that contact and sort of be in touch and have all those little chats and things that you would just have um every day and just in passing that now are a little bit more difficult to do. So yeah, it'd just be really nice to sort of reconnect with people. I think that I'm certainly looking forward to that.
Does this mean that you go out and do field work on your own these days?
I'm very desk-based now, but some of my
Ah, okay.
colleagues are they're out in the field. We had to pause with field work early on in the pandemic until we had really thought through all the kind of safety implications of what we were doing, made sure we put in place new safety measures, and now we're happy that we've done that. My colleagues are back out in the field measuring again, and I'm sort of desk-based at home. So we're sort of actually able to pick up some of our workload again and get going again. But we certainly did have a pause for some activities for a while.
Okay. And so are there any plans for you to release some sort of blog or website for your artistic endeavors?
That is a really good question. I have thought about it, and I don't know, maybe it's just a confidence thing because there's really no going back then, is there, if you go and put something up like that? But yeah, I've certainly thought about it, and it would be, I guess it would sort of push me a little bit to sort of do more and improve as well, which might be a really good thing. So yeah, I might have to give that some thought. Yeah.
Sure, I think it would be fun. I know you're not as comfortable with the guitar yet, but I think seeing your drawings on a Tumblr page or a website, I think that would be a lot of fun.
Hey, and I'll have to do some learning on how to set one of those things up as well, won't I? Get dragged into the current century.
Yes. Well, listen, Steve, it's been a lot of fun. It's been a pleasure reconnecting again. We've already done a Twitch interview a while back, a few months ago, I think,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that was a different format. It was live. It was visual. This was a bit longer and a bit more. You know, uh, we could really talk about more topics. So that was a lot of
yeah.
fun, actually.
Yeah, I
So I
really
really
enjoyed
appreciate
it.
that.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It's been really nice to talk to you again.
Yeah, same here. All right. So, do you want to share your Twitter username so that people can follow you there?
Hey, it's really just easy. It's at Steve Thackeray. I can spell that out if that's helpful. So at Steve, that's quite easy. My surname is Thackeray.
Yeah, so give him a follow, guys, because he posts some really cool things about ecology and about pond life. And I think I've seen a few of your drawings there a few times. So
Oh, they
if you
do
want to get
appear.
a little, yeah, get a little sneak peek at Steve's artistic side, go follow him on Twitter. So thanks again, and I hope that you have a fantastic week.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, and same to you as well.
Thank you.